The captain collapsed at 35,000 feet. A quiet woman in seat 19A stood up. Nobody knew her name, until she keyed the radio, and two F-18 pilots patrolling the Pacific went dead silent. They knew that call sign. Everyone in the Navy did. "This is the night," Widow came back. Before we get into how we got here, comment where you're watching from, and hit subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you won't want to miss. Her name was Elena Vance. 38 years old, navy cardigan, window seat, a paperback she hadn't opened in 2 hours. Trans-Pacific Flight 512, Seattle to Seoul, 6 hours into a 10-hour crossing over black water under a black sky. It was 1:14 in the morning, and most of the cabin was asleep. She had a habit, from her flying days, of counting things without meaning to. The hum of the engines. The rhythm of the cabin lights flickering faintly against turbulence that wasn't there yet. The exact number of minutes since the seatbelt sign had last chimed. It was a habit she'd never managed to unlearn, even 4 years after she'd stopped needing it. Elena was not supposed to be on this flight. 3 days earlier, the regional cargo airline she'd flown for had folded overnight, losing its only major contract without warning. 15 years of flying, first fighters, then freight, reduced to a termination email and a box of personal effects shipped to her apartment in Anchorage. She was on her way to a job interview in Seoul, with a consulting firm that reviewed flight safety programs for airlines that wanted to look responsible on paper. It was the kind of job you take when you've quietly decided you're done being the one at the controls. That decision had cost her more than she let herself admit. For years, 2 months, and 11 days since she'd last touched a yoke. Not that she was counting. Except that she was. Beside her, a college student slept with his headphones still on, a video game paused on his tablet screen. Across the aisle, an elderly couple shared a single blanket. Somewhere behind her, a baby had finally stopped crying an hour ago and hadn't started again. 10,000 small, ordinary lives suspended together in a metal tube over open water, each of them trusting 2 strangers in a locked room at the front of the plane to bring them home. She had no way of knowing that in 11 minutes, that trust, and her own quiet decision to walk away from flying, would both be tested in front of 260 strangers. Captain Robert Holloway was 56, 22 years with the airline, this exact route flown more times than he could count. He liked to say he could fly it with his eyes closed, though he never actually would. First Officer Priya Chandrasekaran was 7 years into her career, sharp, capable, meticulous about her checklists in a way that sometimes made senior captains impatient and sometimes made them grateful. Tonight, it would matter more than either of them yet understood. "Smooth night," Priya said, checking the radar. "Not a bump in 300 miles. "Enjoy it while it lasts," Holloway replied, not looking up from the instrument panel. "We'll pick up some chop past the Kuril Islands, usual place." He reached for his coffee, the same brand he'd been drinking on this route for a decade. His hand didn't quite make it. He pressed 2 fingers briefly to his chest and said nothing. Pilots are trained not to raise an alarm too early, there's a discipline to staying calm, to waiting a beat before deciding something is actually wrong. Sometimes that discipline works against them. He took a slow breath, told himself it was nothing, reached again for the flight computer to acknowledge a routing notification that had just appeared on the display. He never finished the motion. 30 seconds later, without a sound, without so much as a gasp, his head dropped forward onto his chest. "Captain." Priya's voice stayed level, trained. "Captain Holloway." "Nothing." She reached across and touched his shoulder. Still nothing. She checked his pulse with 2 fingers against his neck, faint, rapid, wrong, and immediately hit the intercom, her voice steady even as her stomach dropped. "I need a doctor to the cockpit. Now." "Captain is unresponsive." She took the controls with both hands, adjusting her grip, forcing her breathing to slow the way she'd been trained to. What she didn't know yet, couldn't know, was that 4 minutes earlier, the flight management computer had silently flagged a routing discrepancy at a waypoint called Tovar, a standard checkpoint on the Pacific crossing. Holloway had seen the alert and started to correct it. His heart stopped him mid-motion. The correction sat half-entered in the system, invisible unless someone knew exactly where to look. Left uncorrected, the aircraft would drift nearly 300 miles off its planned track over the next hour, and the fuel calculations tied to that route would silently follow the error, not dangerously wrong yet, but drifting toward a margin that wouldn't leave much room if anything else went wrong tonight. Priya was a good pilot. She had 2.5 years as a first officer and had never once needed to declare an emergency. She had never been alone at the controls of a wide-body jet over open ocean at 1 a.m. with an unconscious captain slumped beside her and a navigation system quietly lying to her. She was managing it. Her hands were steady enough. But her mind was already racing 3 steps ahead of what she actually knew how to do alone. Lead Flight Attendant Marcus Webb reached the cockpit in under 90 seconds, moving faster than passengers ever notice flight crew move. One look at Holloway, slumped and gray, and he understood the shape of the next hour of his life. Pulse is there. Breathing's shallow. He was already reaching for the emergency medical kit stowed behind the cockpit door. I need someone up here who can fly. Now. He didn't wait for anyone to tell him what to do next. It was in the training, the way it always was, you ask, calmly, before panic can spread through the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your lead flight attendant. If there is a licensed pilot on board, commercial, military, any pilot at all, please press your call button immediately. 40 seconds passed. Nobody pressed anything. Marcus walked the aisles himself, quietly, row by row, starting at the front so as not to wake the whole cabin at once. Business class, nothing. The first rows of economy, nothing. He kept moving, his heart rate climbing with every empty row, doing the math on how much longer this could go on before he had to consider other options that got worse the longer this list went unanswered. Then, in row 19, a woman in a navy cardigan reached up and pressed her call button before she had fully decided to do it. Her hand moved almost on its own, the way a muscle remembers a motion the mind has tried hard to forget. Marcus reached her in 15 seconds. "Ma'am, are you a pilot?" Elena looked at her own hand, still resting near the button, as if surprised to find it there. "I was," she said quietly. "Air Force. Fighters. I flew cargo for 6 years after that." She paused, and something in her voice tightened. "I haven't flown anything in 4 years. My commercial medical certificate lapsed 2 years ago. I'm not supposed to be flying anything at all." Marcus didn't hesitate, and he didn't have the luxury of caring about paperwork right now. "Can you fly the plane?" She didn't answer immediately. She looked toward the front of the cabin, though she couldn't see the cockpit from row 19. But she felt it, a shift in the aircraft's attitude so faint that most passengers would never register it in a lifetime of flying, a yaw of maybe half a degree, the plane very gently drifting off its intended line. She noticed it before Marcus finished his sentence. "Yes," she said, already unbuckling her seatbelt. She walked up the aisle with her heart hammering and her face perfectly still, the same stillness she'd trained into herself 20 years earlier and never fully lost. For years since she'd sat in any cockpit. Longer since she'd flown anything the size of a wide-body airliner. But underneath the fear, a separate, older part of her mind was already running through the checklist: scan the panel first, find out what's actually wrong before touching anything, don't assume, verify. Priya looked up sharply as the cockpit door opened. "Who are you?" "Elena Vance. Former U.S. Air Force fighter pilot. Over 5,000 flight hours, military and civilian combined. 6 years flying cargo widebodies out of Anchorage." She dropped into the jump seat, eyes already scanning the panel with the fast, practiced sweep of someone reading an instrument layout she'd once known cold. "You have an unresolved routing flag at Tover. Has it been acknowledged?" Priya blinked, startled. "No, I didn't even see it come up. It's been active at least 4 minutes. You're drifting off track, and your fuel burn is calculating against the wrong route. We need to correct it in the next 10 minutes or we're looking at a real problem on approach." Priya nodded and made room without arguing. There wasn't time to argue, and something about the calm, exact way this stranger spoke made arguing feel unnecessary. Behind them, Marcus and another attendant, with help from a passenger who identified himself as an emergency room physician traveling home from a conference, carefully moved Holloway out of his seat and laid him flat in the narrow space behind the cockpit, monitoring his pulse and starting supplemental oxygen. Elena sat down in the captain's chair. She put her hands on the controls for the first time in 4 years. The yoke felt cold under her palms for half a second, and then simply right, the way a language you haven't spoken out loud in years is still there, waiting, the moment you need it. She keyed the radio. "Pacific Control, this is Trans-Pacific 512 Heavy. I need to declare an emergency. We have a medical emergency, Captain incapacitated. I am a former military and civilian pilot taking temporary command of the aircraft. My commercial certification is currently lapsed. Requesting emergency assistance and diversion clearance." A pause. 4 seconds, long in radio time. 512, Pacific Control, understood. State your name and background for the record. Elena Vance. Former U.S. Air Force. Call sign, widow. The channel went quiet. Not busy quiet, not congested quiet. Actually quiet, the kind of silence that means something on the other end has stopped moving. And then, faint, bleeding in from a military frequency running close by, the kind of overlap that happens sometimes far out over open ocean, a transmission that wasn't meant for her at all. Did she say widow? A second voice, half a beat later, disbelieving, "Widows flying that thing?" Then nothing. Because trained fighter pilots don't chatter on an open channel, they go silent, they do the job, they say nothing that isn't procedure. But for 3 or 4 seconds before they caught themselves, 2 F-18 pilots on a night patrol out of a carrier group 200 miles south had forgotten themselves completely. Elena heard every word. She said nothing. Her hand stayed steady on the controls, her eyes on the instruments. 260 people were behind her, and there was work to do. Whatever that name meant to anyone out there in the dark, it could wait. The name hadn't come from nowhere. 16 years before that night, a 26-year-old lieutenant named Elena Vance had been flying a night combat air patrol over contested airspace with a wingman named Diaz. It was supposed to be routine as anything is at night, over water, in an aircraft built for one purpose. 40 minutes into the patrol, Diaz's jet suffered a cascading electrical failure. He lost his radar. He lost his transponder, the system that told every friendly aircraft and every ground station he wasn't a threat. He lost radio contact entirely. He could still fly the airplane. He simply could not tell anyone, anywhere, who he was. At night, in contested airspace, an aircraft that cannot identify itself is a target waiting for someone, somewhere, to make a fatal mistake about what it is. Elena didn't radio for instructions, because there was no time and no one to ask. She made the decision the way she made most decisions that mattered, fast, alone, and terrified underneath a face that gave away nothing. She flew her jet into tight formation on Diaz's wing, close enough that any radar sweep watching them would register a single contact instead of 2, hers, the one still broadcasting a friendly signal. She became his identity. For 38 minutes, wingtip nearly touching wingtip in total darkness, she absorbed every bit of the risk onto her own aircraft, flying close enough that a mistake by either of them could have ended both of their careers, or worse, until he was close enough to base to be recognized safely and guided home. When they landed, Diaz told the debrief officer exactly what had happened. Asked what to call the maneuver, he said the only word that felt right, that she'd flown beside him like something not quite alive, silent and constant, refusing to let him disappear from the world. Someone in the room, half joking, called her widow. It stopped being a joke within a year. The details of that night stayed classified. The shape of the story didn't. It traveled the way things do among people whose lives depend on each other, quietly, without exaggeration, carried from one squadron to the next until every fighter pilot in that theater knew some version of it. Nobody ever asked whether she'd been afraid. She had been, every second of those 38 minutes, hands sweating inside her gloves, throat tight, absolutely certain she was making the right call and absolutely certain, at the same time, that certainty didn't guarantee anything. She simply hadn't let the fear change what her hands were doing. That was the part nobody ever put in the story, and the part she thought mattered most. 12 years later, she left the service, not by choice, exactly. A round of budget cuts, a restructuring nobody outside the building fully understood, a commanding officer who told her privately it was a mistake, that nothing in her record justified it, that it had more to do with a conflict with someone above her pay grade than anything she'd actually done. She could have fought it. People told her she should. Fighting would have meant 2 more years inside a system that had just told her, in the most bureaucratic language possible, that it didn't need her anymore. She was tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. So she didn't fight it. She flew cargo instead, because the sky was still the only place that made complete sense to her, even after everything else stopped making sense. 41 minutes after Elena took the controls, the ER physician came forward with an update, his voice low and careful. Holloway had almost certainly suffered a serious cardiac event, treatable, likely survivable, but he needed a hospital, and not in the 4 hours it would take to reach Seoul. Closest option, Elena said without looking away from the panel. Priya checked the charts, fingers moving fast. We're past the point where turning back saves time. Seoul's actually our fastest option now, unless the weather holds for Sapporo. That's 40 minutes closer. Elena had landed in Sapporo before, years ago, flying cargo through weather that would have grounded most commercial flights. She remembered the approach, the terrain around the field, the frequencies. Pacific Control, 512, requesting diversion to New Chitos, Sapporo. Medical emergency requires the fastest possible landing. Copy, 512. Diversion approved, Vector 310, descend and maintain flight level 280. Sapporo has been notified, emergency crews standing by. Copy. Thank you. She turned to Priya. You've got navigation and radios. Call out every item on the checklist. Don't skip anything, I don't care if you think I already know it. Say it out loud anyway. Priya nodded, steadier now than she'd been an hour earlier. Something about having someone beside her who so clearly knew what she was doing had settled her nerves more than any training scenario ever had. The thing about flying an aircraft through an emergency is that the aircraft itself doesn't know there's an emergency happening inside it. It doesn't care that the woman flying it hasn't sat in a cockpit in 4 years. It doesn't care that her certification lapsed, or that 260 people are sitting quietly behind her not fully understanding what's happening, or that somewhere south of here 2 Navy pilots went silent hearing her name. It only knows lift and drag, thrust and weight, and the pressure of the hands on the controls. Elena reduced power. The nose eased down gently. She talked herself through it under her breath, out of habit rather than nerves. 6 years of solo cargo flights teaches you to narrate your own hands, because there's nobody else in the cockpit to hear it. Passing flight level 290. Rate of descent nominal. Speed 280. Behind her, Marcus moved quietly through the cabin, keeping passengers calm with short, honest updates, a medical emergency, a precautionary landing, nothing more than they needed to know yet. Most passengers had no idea a woman from row 19 was now flying the aircraft. A few had noticed her walk forward and not return. Word moved through the cabin in whispers, the way it does, faster than any announcement could travel. 38 minutes to landing. 22. 12. New Chitos approach cleared them straight in for runway 01L. Clear skies, good visibility, number 1 in sequence, the kind of night that, under any other circumstance, would have made for an easy landing. Gear down. Gear down, 3 green. Flaps 20. Confirmed. They ran the checklist item by item, Priya reading, Elena confirming, neither of them skipping a single line even as the runway resolved from a distant smear of light into a solid, waiting stripe of concrete. 500 feet. Stable. 400. 300. Elena was thinking about the flare now, the exact moment, just before touchdown, when you arrest the descent and let the main gear meet the ground first. It felt different on every aircraft type, and this one wasn't the type she'd flown most, but she'd felt its weight and rhythm building through the whole descent, and she trusted what her hands already knew. 200 feet. 100. The threshold slid beneath them. Elena eased back on the yoke, a motion so small it barely registered as movement, and brought the throttles to idle. The nose came up a fraction. The main gear touched, both sides together, one clean, solid contact, no bounce. She brought the nose down, deployed reverse thrust, applied the brakes, felt the aircraft shed speed in a long, controlled deceleration that felt, for the first time in over an hour, entirely ordinary. At 60 knots she came off the brakes. At the taxiway, she brought the aircraft to a full stop and finally let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for the better part of an hour. The intercom clicked on. Marcus's voice, steady but not quite steady enough to hide what he felt underneath it, "We're on the ground." The cabin didn't erupt into applause so much as exhale, all at once, the particular sound of 260 people releasing an hour of fear they hadn't fully let themselves feel until it was safely over. Somewhere in the back, someone was crying quietly. A man near the front said something in Korean that a flight attendant later translated, roughly, as "thank you, thank you." "We landed it," Priya said, looking over at her. "You navigated it the whole second half," Elena said. "I've never been more scared." Elena was quiet for a moment. "Neither have I," she admitted. "I just didn't stop." Paramedics were aboard within 6 minutes. Holloway was off the aircraft first, on a stretcher, stable, breathing on his own, the ER physician walking alongside explaining what had happened to the waiting crew. The diversion, investigators would later confirm in writing, had almost certainly saved his life. A few more hours in the air, and the outcome might have been very different. The investigation began that same night. Airline safety officials, Japanese aviation authorities, the airline's own operations team, all of them wanted the same things: flight data, radio transcripts, instrument logs, and a statement from the person who'd been flying. Elena gave hers at 4 in the morning, in a small conference room at the airport, over a cup of vending machine coffee she barely touched. She walked the investigators through every decision, every radio call, every instrument reading she'd noted, and she left nothing out, including the fact that her commercial certification had lapsed. The investigator, a careful, methodical man named Ito, made a note of it. "You're aware that flying a commercial aircraft without a valid certificate is a serious regulatory matter?" "Yes." "And you did it anyway." 260 passengers, Elena said. "And a first officer who had never landed one of these alone." Ito looked at his notes for a long moment. He looked at her. He wrote something else down. He didn't raise the subject again. The airline's vice president of flight operations, a man named Daniel Reyes, flew in from Seattle by early charter, arriving before sunrise. He'd already reviewed the flight recorder data on the way, listened to the radio transcript twice, read the preliminary instrument report. He sat across from Elena in the same conference room and looked at her for a long moment before speaking. "You identified a navigation conflict that our own system had flagged but never escalated to the crew," he said. "The threshold for an audible alert was set too high. It should have triggered the moment the correction went half-entered," Elena said. "It didn't." Reyes wrote something down. "We're going to fix that." "Good." The report also shows 17 system anomalies that accumulated over the course of the flight. Captain Holloway acknowledged 2 before his event. "You cleared the rest in what looks like about 4 minutes." I've flown cargo long enough to read a messy panel fast, Elena said simply. Reyes set his pen down. Miss Vance. Why didn't you fight to keep your commission when you left the service? Elena hadn't expected that question, not here, not from him. That's not really relevant to. I've been making calls since 3 in the morning, Reyes said gently. Your record was declassified 4 years ago. I read about Widow. I read about the discharge. I want to understand why someone with your record would simply accept a wrongful separation instead of fighting it. Elena looked toward the window. Outside, the first orange light of dawn was coming up over the bay, flat and beautiful the way dawn always is over water. I was tired, she said finally. I'd been carrying that name for a long time, the Navy, the career, the story people told about me that never quite matched what actually happened up there. I just wanted to be a pilot. Not a legend. Just a pilot. You are a pilot, Reyes said. I was a cargo pilot. My contract ended 2 weeks ago. He picked his pen back up, wrote something, and slid the notepad across the table. On it was a number, a salary figure, and beneath it, in neat handwriting, Director of Flight Safety and Standards. Elena looked at the number. She looked at Reyes. I don't have a current medical certificate, she said. You'll have one within 30 days. We'll handle the process, and if it takes longer than that, the position will still be here waiting. She called her daughter from the gate 2 hours later, before the positioning flight to Seoul that the airline had arranged. Her daughter, Hannah, 20 years old and spending the semester abroad, answered on the second ring, groggy. Mom. It's the middle of the night, why are you calling? I'm in Sapporo, Elena said. Flight diverted. It's a long story, I'll tell you when I see you. A pause, and then her daughter, suddenly wide awake in the way only a daughter can be about her mother's voice. Mom. Are you okay? I'm fine. Completely fine. You sound like you haven't slept. I haven't. But I'm fine, Hannah. I promise. She hung up and sat in the gate chair, watching the departures board, thinking about everything she'd said to Reyes an hour earlier. I was tired of being a legend, I just wanted to be a pilot, and wondering, honestly, whether that had ever really been true, or whether it was just the version of the story that was easiest to say out loud. Elena took the job. Her certification came through in 19 days. The review board, after reading the flight data and the investigator's report, found nothing in her decision-making they would have done differently, and said so in writing. Her first day at the airline's operations center, nobody recognized her, just a woman in a blazer carrying coffee, looking for the conference room where her first safety review was scheduled. She found it, sat down. When the lead safety officer, a man named Brennan, introduced her to the room as our new director of standards, with some recent hands-on experience over the Pacific, the room laughed the particular laugh of people who understand exactly what that means without needing it explained further. Elena didn't laugh along. I've reviewed our current alert escalation thresholds, she said, before Brennan could move on to the next agenda item. I have 11 changes I'd like to propose. Brennan looked surprised, then pleased. Go ahead. She went through them one by one, specific, technical, precise, each one traced directly back to something she'd seen on an instrument panel at 1 in the morning with 260 strangers lives in her hands. A gap here. A threshold set at a comfortable level instead of a correct one. A system that had never once been tested against a real emergency until it had to be. 6 months after that, sitting in on a simulator evaluation for new first officers, she watched a trainee named Sophia handle a simulated engine failure on takeoff, the hardest moment in commercial flight, cleanly, correctly, every call made properly, with a 2-second hesitation before declaring the emergency. Isn't that a problem? Sophia asked, when the instructor turned to Elena for comments. No, Elena said. That's judgment, not fear. The 2 seconds meant you evaluated before you acted. The pilots who worry me are the ones who don't take those 2 seconds. She paused. Were you scared? Yes, Sophia admitted. Good. Stay scared. Just don't stop. Somewhere on a carrier deck in the Pacific, two F-18 pilots sat in the officers' mess one evening months later, eating dinner, when one of them scrolled past a short news item on a tablet, a paragraph, nothing more, about an emergency landing at New Chitos, about a former Air Force pilot who had taken command of a passenger jet and brought 260 people home safely. He set the tablet down. His wingman was already looking at him, because he'd read the same paragraph a minute earlier and hadn't said anything either. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. They both remembered exactly what those 5 seconds on an open frequency had meant, months earlier, and they both understood, without needing it spelled out, that she had heard them break protocol, said nothing about it, and simply gone back to flying the airplane, because that was the job, and the job had never once been about anyone noticing. There was a word for that. They'd both known it for 16 years, ever since a terrified 26-year-old lieutenant flew wingtip to wingtip through the dark and never asked anyone to remember her for it. The word was pilot. The truest kind there is. Captain Holloway made a full recovery and returned to flying 14 months later. His first flight back was the Seattle-Seoul route. He asked that Elena Vance be told. She sent him 2 words, "Welcome back." He had them framed and hung in his home office, next to a photo of his crew. The navigation alert threshold that failed that night was corrected across the entire fleet within 60 days. It has triggered early, exactly as intended, on 9 occasions since. None of those 9 became emergencies. Priya Chandrasekaran was upgraded to captain 2 years later, the youngest in the airline's history to make the jump. She still keeps a printed copy of that night's flight log in her bag, folded small, in the front pocket where she keeps the things that matter. The 2 F-18 pilots have never publicly confirmed they were the voices on that frequency that night. They've never needed to.